Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. So we're going to be taking everyone through the highlights of the Responsible Artificial Intelligence Index. This is the second time we've published the RAI Index. This has been a really important piece of strategic work, which is sponsored by IAG and Transurban with the support of the Gradient Institute and the Responsible Metaverse Alliance. And also with also significant input from Data 61 and the National Artificial Intelligence Centre. So this is a really important piece of collaborative work that has really important applications in today's world. With me today, I've got a wonderful cast of panelists. I think this is a rock star group of panelists. So with me today, I have Stela. Stela's the director of the National Artificial Intelligence Centre. Stela's focused on building value for Australian people and businesses in the country through the use of AI. She's got 15 years of experience, and most recently before NAIC, she was Global Director of AI Solutions and Strategy at Microsoft. She's also got 7 years working in the US technology industry. And for those in the audience that don't know about the NAIC, it was established to further develop Australia's AI and digital ecosystem. Chris Dolman, and Chris is the Executive Manager of Data and Algorithmic Ethics at IAG. He's an actuary by training who moved into the data analytics space, and in recent years, Chris has chosen really to immerse himself in questions around responsible AI, data, and algorithmic ethics. He was awarded Actuary of the Year in 2022 by the Actuaries Institute for his work in data ethics and responsible AI. Bill Simpson-Young is the CEO of the Gradient Institute. Bill has 20 years of experience of building teams of software engineers and researchers and product designers to build and develop novel techniques and technologies and products and get these into widespread use and adoption. He's been on the executive teams of leading Australian science and technology organisations, including Data 61. And finally, Artak Amirbekyan, he's the head of data analytics at Transurban. He's got a PhD in data mining from Griffith University, and prior to Transurban, he was the executive manager of Commonwealth Bank's AI Labs. So, like I say, this is a rock star cast of panelists. Welcome to you all. So we love interaction. I'm going to present the results of the report first for about 20 minutes or so. We're really keen to get your questions in here. So after I presented, we'll have a panel discussion. And we really want audience participation. This is your opportunity to ask our panelists burning questions that you have. You may not get another opportunity again to have such luminaries in the RAI field to get your questions answered. So please jump in and we will answer those questions. What I'm going to do is as I walk you through the highlights from the report, I'm going to explain a little bit more about how we built the index, how we did the research, and then we'll look at the state of artificial intelligence and application in Australia, and in particular, the extent to which that's being developed responsibly, looking back at what's changed since we did the index first in 2021. We'll do a deeper dive into awareness of the Australian AI ethics principles and the extent to which those principles are being deployed in practice, and the difference between where organisations think they're at in terms of their performance and the actual actions they're taking to deploy AI systems responsibly. And then we'll talk about how we can bridge the gap, and that will form part of our panel discussion. Okay, without further ado, let's get into the index itself. So I think the first point to note here is the date when fieldwork was conducted. It was conducted towards the final quarter of last year. Now that's prior to the launch and widespread adoption of ChatGPT, the OpenAI system that many of us have all been using, and which has been consuming media attention since it was launched this year. And obviously more recently, we've got Google's variant of that, Bard. So in terms of when the fieldwork was conducted, this was prior to that, but that doesn't make the findings here any less relevant. In fact, I think it makes them even more important and more relevant in today's environment. This was conducted via an online business-to-business research panel. We talked about maturity, AI usage, awareness of the principles, attitudes to deploying AI responsibly, the strategies that are being taken, and the actions that are being deployed. The sample is good. We've got a good mixture of medium and very large organizations who completed the survey, and all of the respondents were people who had some level of oversight and responsibility for AI systems. The index is based on a maturity model, which has two components to it, one of which asks for respondents to assess how well they think their organization performs on 16 different statements about responsible AI. They fall into 5 broad categories around the role of the leadership and accountability thereof, and governance, people and skills, data and security, and monitoring and review. So that's one component. And the answers to those statements form 3/4 of the model results. And then we weigh that up against the actions taken. And interestingly, organizations or participants who completed the survey generally kind of were quite optimistic about their organization's performance, but when it came to the actions, those actions didn't necessarily always match up to their assessment of performance, which is why we have the actions taken being an important part of that. And it tends to kind of counter the potential tendency for people to overscore their performance. So that gives you a score out of 100. And then when we model that as here we can see that the scores range, obviously can range from a theoretical 0 to a maximum of 100. What we're seeing here is, compared with 2021, there has been disappointingly little change. So the mean score overall is 62.1 versus 61.6 in 2021. The change is insignificant, 0.5 points on that scale. No real change there. And I think we feel that is it disappointing? I think when we saw the results a little bit so, but there has been some change. So I think we're seeing some more maturity in terms of the adoption and use of AI, which means we've got fewer sitting in the planning stage. So anybody with a score of below 50, we would categorize as being in the planning stage, the planning level of maturity for responsible AI deployment. And then we've got a big shift upwards in terms of those that are in that initiating phase. So anything with a score of 50 to 64, that accounts now for 46% of the sample. And then not much change in the developing stage. And then really where we've set the bar high to be in the maturing segment. So you need a score of 80 or more out of 100. And only 3% are in that group. That's down from 5%. It's not statistically significant, that change. I think it just tells us that the number of organizations ultimately that are yet to be in the maturing phase is low. It's below 10%. We feel that kind of just generally when we think about the level of maturity of Australian organizations at developing responsible AI systems, the view of the various experts who've made an input into this piece of work is that we are somewhat behind other leading global economies. To quick summarize, what does it mean to be in the different stages? I mean, ultimately, let's take the maturing segment, because I think that's where many organizations would aspire to be at. If you're maturing, you've implemented auditing processes, really kind of strong focus there on accountability, and a real strong focus on the moral and ethical implications. And this is not all driven internally, but we're drawing on external experts as well. So not many are really in that stage. I think that's kind of an aspirational phase for many, but it will be encouraging to see more in the developing stage, and particularly, having the strong, taking external guidelines, software tools, and so on, and bringing those internally and developing your own guidelines for the responsible use of AI. I think that would be a very good, important hallmark of a developing organization, of an organization that is at a developing stage of maturity, coupled with a really strong culture of data protection and security. And ideally that culture, really kind of driven by and exemplified by the organizational leadership. And so on that point about, the CEO, the leadership being responsible, where we see, when we ask the question, who is responsible for driving your AI strategy, those respondents that selected the CEO as being ultimately responsible, they are noticeably more mature than those where the CEO is not taking the lead. So roughly a 5-point gap. It nudges those organizations into the developing segment and out of the initiating segment. I think we can't underestimate the importance of having the CEO taking the lead on the AI strategy, because the impact that has on culture, the impact that has on governance and governance processes. And ultimately what that means is that our AI practices are becoming a kind of a standard level of routine. It's built and baked in to internal processes. Survey asks kind of, as well as obviously those that quite sophisticated way of building the model, we also just kind of sense check that at the end of the questionnaire to say, okay, tell us on an overall scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate your organization's current capability to design and build a responsible AI system? And it's, clearly, as one would expect, the developing and mature segments are giving, a rating of 9 or 10 out of 10. 56% of the developing say 9 or 10 out of 10. And, clearly those in the initiating phase, which, constitutes, just under half of our sample, still not completely confident, still relatively unsure. So people are not necessarily, I think it kind of validates the segmentation that we've created for the index. So having a strategy that's tied to the wider business strategy is really important, because it demonstrates the importance of AI as not just being a kind of a project on the side that's just applicable to certain parts of the business, but really driving the whole of the organization and influencing strategy across the board. I think kind of what's encouraging is that compared with 2021, this year we do see some change. That's gone up from 60%, from 51% to 60% for those who say, yes, we've got a strategy for all organizations, for all the divisions within our organizations. I think that's encouraging. I think it demonstrates a shift away from tactical AI decision-making to something that's much more strategic in orientation. And indeed, then when you then look at those organizations that say that they've got their strategy tied to all parts of the business, they're more likely to be having the CEO driving the strategy than those who say our strategy is only tied to some division. So again, it kind of provides further evidence that the organizations that are leading this, leading the AI strategy across all divisions, this is increasingly within the CEO's remit to ensure greater accountability. Okay, so moving on to the Australian AI principles. Most of you, I would imagine, are at least have some level of familiarity with the fact that we have a set of principles developed by the Department of Industry, and encouragingly, 70% of our samples said that they were aware of these principles, which is up significantly from 2021. So I think that's very, again, that's an encouraging sign that, if we can increase more awareness, ultimately that will help us to drive more industry engagement on why a responsible approach to AI has benefits for the community and benefits for business. But also, I think we kind of also feel that moving from principles to practice often is a big step. And I think that's something we're going to come on to. So, well, okay, so how can you ground these principles into real world actions that organizations can take and deploy? But at least awareness is up. Having standards in place, I think, is also important. Now, this wasn't tracked, so this is a first time we asked this question about whether organizations have AI standards in place. Now, look, we don't know what those standards look like. We've not gone in, and we can't go in and scrutinize those standards. And I think what one organization might see as being AI standards versus another versus what a panel of experts might see, there could be some differences in there. So I think that really being able to apply the standards that one would consider to be best practice, I think is really important. But certainly it's encouraging that as you kind of move along the maturity ladder, we see there's a higher level of adoption of having AI standards in place. Now, let's move on to the specifics of AI principles. And so these sit around these 4 areas identified in bold, uppercase on the left-hand side of this chart. So what we're asking were statements that ultimately we can link back to each of the principles. And we ask respondents to the survey to indicate the extent to which they agree or disagree with each of these statements. So I think the first thing is that a dark blue and a royal blue color indicates either strong agreement or some level of agreement. There's very little disagreement, which is kind of not surprising. But these statements aren't about general views on AI systems. These are about your organization. So our leadership can be held accountable. Our AI systems are designed to be safe. They comply with relevant privacy, etc. The statements are very specific to the organization which the participant is completing the survey on behalf of. And what they're saying is that generally, we agree that we are our systems perform well in terms of accountability because we've got a leadership that can be held accountable. We've got systems that are designed to be safe and not harm or deceive people. They're compliant with privacy. We can show how our algorithms work. Quantifiable benefits. The word quantifiable is really important. Generate quantifiable benefits to society and so on. We've got challenge processes in place. Okay, that's good. And fairness. We've got systems in place to minimize negative impacts on individuals and communities. And ultimately, we've designed systems to be human-centered at their core. So there's a really strong level of agreement with each of those statements. So you kind of sit back and think it's pretty encouraging. But I've already shown you the scores are not great. Score of 62. We're not making progress. So clearly there's something at play here in relation to the how people think their systems are performing. And ultimately, I think it kind of boils down to the actions that are being taken. And this is where, I think we get a real kind of level of concern, where we compare the actions that were taken, that were being taken when we completed the survey in 21 versus 22. And what we're seeing is that, for example, really pretty much across all of these different actions, which can ultimately be linked back to principles as well, is that, nothing has progressed forward. Everything's gone backwards. So engaging leadership teams on issues around responsible AI, that's gone backwards. That doesn't line up with the views about accountability. Taking, monitoring and reviewing algorithms for potential bias down from 31 to 26%. So, look, you can go through each of these statements, individually and, take your time to read them carefully. And like I say, there's a few highlights in there. What we did when we looked at that, we connected each of these actions back to those statements about AI performance, the ones where we saw those high levels of agreement, and we looked at the total agreement on the left-hand side, and then we looked at the actions taken to really kind of highlight what we're calling the responsible AI gap. And it's big. I mean, look, the average gap is 58 points, right? If you take an average of the actions taken against the average agreement with statements, and you look at the gap between each of these averages out at 58 points. That's a big gap. There's a real difference between what people are saying how they think their systems are designed and the actions they're taking. I'll take reliability and safety just as a good example. 84% agree that the systems are designed to be safe and not harm or deceive people. Only 25% are monitoring outcomes for customers or employees. So just one example. Contestability, kind of similar finding there as well. Really concerning that we think we're doing the right thing. This is what we're calling the action gap. So few are taking the right actions that we would expect an organization to take if they were really developing AI systems responsibly. A really important talking point as to why that is the case. Is that because organizations struggle to find the right guidelines, the right software tools, of which there are certainly many out there potentially? Okay, in terms of the benefits, stepping back, and we asked about, does a responsible AI approach to AI give your organization a competitive advantage or no advantage or a competitive disadvantage? Very few, even those in the planning phase would say that it gives them a competitive disadvantage. I think only 10% of that segment said it's a competitive disadvantage. So even those that are at the relative early stage of their journey are seeing a net win in terms of this is a competitive advantage. I kind of found that a little bit surprising that as many of those in that planning stage did feel that's the case. So in other words, this is good for business as much as well as it's good for society, individuals, and community. I kind of feel that maybe this is not a hard sell from a commercial perspective, and clearly those that are in the more more mature stage, 47% in the developing stage, so that responsible AI gives them a competitive advantage. So amongst the pressure that there is to launch and develop AI systems and learn how to deploy large language models in the business and so on, yes, there is a race to get to innovate, but innovation can happen in hand with responsibility. And again, more organizations are saying, this was tracked back to 21, more are saying that the benefits outweigh the costs. 61% are now saying the benefits outweigh the costs. And they're saying that off the back of more experience of developing AI systems. I think the more experience you have, the more evidence you have to demonstrate clearly that the benefits are outweighing the costs. Cool. So those are the highlights, from the report. If you've not already done so, you can download that. All of the assets are on the Fifth Quadrant website. Obviously, if you haven't, I encourage you to go down there and take a further look if you want to take a deeper dive. But I'd like to kind of just step back now and open this up. Firstly, for a panel discussion, and then we'll have an audience Q&A. Like I say, just keep putting your questions in the Q&A button on the Zoom webinar menu. If you can put your questions in Q&A, that would be great. And we'll jump in there and also look at your questions as well. But yeah, first, I'm really kind of open to the panel. Ultimately, I think the challenge is having the tools and the processes in place to ensure responsible AI. That's the fall down that we're seeing as evidence from the report. But if organizations don't know what to do in order to build responsible AI, well, how can we help them is the question I have. I'm going to open this up to the panel to get your take on the report and your views on why the gap exists and what we can do to close it. So shall I pick on people? Would someone like to jump in? Stella, you're going to jump in.
Sure, I'll get started. So the report, as you mentioned, is very revealing. And, on the surface, it might seem like at the top end has maybe gone a little bit backwards. But the way I see it is that last year when this report was done, we potentially did not know what we don't know. So it was a bit of a case of I don't know what I don't know. And that's how many organizations have entered the AI and the responsible AI arena. The area we're in now is we're much more aware of what we don't know. We're much more aware of the complexities when it comes to responsible AI. So there is a way, and I'm in particular reading it, that our understanding of the complexity has increased. And there is that underlying understanding that the landscape has shifted in, the past 6 months in particular, but even the past year, where that dynamic of knowing the areas that we cannot control, that we cannot fully define, are just much more pronounced. And that's a good thing. That is the step before we move into the next one, which is knowing and then taking action and maturing. It's also really positive to see that many more are in those starting phases. But really, it's a testament to the fact that we are all navigating an area that is being built as we are also building our own solutions within it. So the responsible AI approach is something that can be a competitive differentiator for many companies. And in fact, in the current landscape, there was another report by IBM which said that over 70% of organizations are not doing anything about the underlying bias in their data. That is a huge number of organizations not doing anything about it. So it stays true that if organizations do take steps responsibly towards AI, that can not only serve as a good thing for the way product services are delivered and developed, but it can also serve as a competitive advantage.
Great, thanks, Stella. And I think you really alluded to a very important point that I think organisations they're realising that developing AI responsibly is a little bit tougher than perhaps we first thought. I think, Bill, when we first shared the findings with you, that was something that I think you reflected on as well. I mean, since then, how have your thoughts developed?
Yeah, so hi everyone. It is the case that a lot of organizations adopting AI think it's going to be easy. Yeah, they've got a lot of data, there's lots of code out there, and chuck use machine learning, chuck the data code, and build a model, right? What could be hard about that? But of course, doing that responsibly is much harder than people realize. Even when you have some high-level principles like the federal government's ethics principles and all the other similar things around the world, they're at the principle level. They don't really help you know how to use AI responsibly. They're a good starting point. They're good for some high-level checklists. What we often find with, Grady Institute does a lot of work with companies who are using AI, and often they'll bring us in when they realize how hard things are. And they'll say, look, we're trying to be fair. We want to be fair. We've agreed that we're going to be fair. The board have said we should be fair. They get the AI labs or the AI developers in the organization understanding fairness metrics. But there's a lot more than wanting to be fair, knowing how to measure fairness, than actually having fairly operating systems. There's about how people say, well, how do we choose which fairness measure to pick for this particular application? And so, understanding the whole context of use within the organization, within a particular application or system, understanding how to measure, and understanding once you have identified that there's some unfairness there, how you mitigate the unfairness in the system, such the system can operate fairly. There's a lot of complexity in there, a lot that people have to know to actually do that, and it's hard.
Right. Well, I'm going to talk a bit more about some of the practical steps we can take. But yeah, before that, I mean, Chris, obviously you were part of the team that helped to launch the inaugural index. Chris, do you see any crumbs of comfort from this wave of research?
Crumbs of comfort, gosh. Hello, everyone. I mean, first, I guess we're delighted to sponsor this again. It's quite important research, and it's great that we get a snapshot of what's going on from the survey respondents. So it's a very, very useful report, and certainly I've personally found it quite interesting to look at what people have been saying. I think, and I've said this for a number of years now, it's sort of obvious to me that there would be this gap emerging, because it's quite easy, I think, for people to nod along to the high level principles and sort of convince themselves that yes, this is a good thing to be doing, and of course we're going to be fair or monitor things or what have you. But then when you actually ask specific questions of people about what they're actually doing, you will often find that there's going to be limitations. And I think as others have said, it's perhaps become clear over the last year or two how some of this can be in practice and how much has to be worked through. So I think in some ways it's good that perhaps that's been recognised, and that degradation of results perhaps from one year to the next might be reflection of the fact that this is being recognised more thoroughly in society. So hopefully we might see improvements in future, because I think a lot of the actions that are recommended in the report and that are recommended elsewhere are things that people can quite readily go ahead and do, and things that we've been IAG for quite some time, thankfully. So I think if you express them as not so much ethics principles, but just responsible AI or AI risk management or those sorts of terms, I think businesses can get on board with those ideas of sort of risk management and governance perhaps a bit easier than words like ethics that can be a little bit unusual to some people in industry. So that can sometimes help as well.
Yeah, no, great, thanks. And I think that was also part of our thinking behind why we're calling the index the responsible AI index rather than the ethical AI index, for the reasons that you just outlined. Artak, again, it's been a real pleasure to have Transurban sponsoring and supporting the report. What are your thoughts? Do you feel that there's some good messages here in terms of the steps that organizations can begin to take? I mean, clearly it identifies these gaps, but what are your thoughts in terms of moving to this thinking around real kind of practical actions?
Thank you very much. So we were actually delighted to sponsor this index, and I remember when we met with Kat, I can't remember what forum was it, and then she just turned around to me and said, "Oh, do you guys want to sponsor the index we're going to do this year?" I said, "Okay, what is that?" And then she said, and then I said, "Yeah, that kind of sounds really important for us to do it." And given that I was one of those people who were involved in the original kind of creation of those ethical principles from the government, and I was back then in a CBA and working from the CBA part and contributing to the ethical index. I remember those days when we were discussing what is the ethical principles, and it was so hard to come up with a kind of a view, but because everyone brings their own perspective, right? What's ethical, what is not. And I think I remember one point I said, look, people couldn't figure out the ethics in the thousands of years. I don't think we can fix that in this meeting. And that was like really kind of interesting to, even if you think about Australia and think about globally, it's very different. People approach these sorts of problems, right? From the perspective of the report, I'm not surprised at all. Right, I think those days when we started to go with having a lot of data is good, right? Because we need a lot of AI use cases to do, and we need to show the value from these AI use cases. And every company started to kind of get all this data together. And then last year we started to see all sorts of breaches with the big companies. Right, from the data breaches, that the companies were hoarding this data for a while and didn't think about the privacy, security, and all sorts of other aspects of responsible AI that we have in this index. And now you get the problem is data from becoming asset become a liability. All right. So the index itself is not surprising, I think, because once you agree with the principles and then start to implement it, you find it very hard. Right. And like, okay, now I agree with that. Now what, right? And particularly when you are in the business, everything goes very fast, and you have the things to do. You have your deadlines, you have your projects, you have all sorts of things you need to do. Is to what is like exactly I need to do? It's like really important, really hard to put that into your development and things going. But I think I can give a little bit more examples later on when we talk about use cases. I don't want to go a lot of details, but from my perspective, I'm not surprised, right? Once you start actually implementation, then this is where you find that you can't actually do it easily.
Yeah, no, brilliant. I will come on to use cases. I'm really kind of keen to hear Transurban and IAG use cases. But I think you raised a really interesting tension point there as well between data as both an asset and simultaneously a liability. In organizations. I think that's a really interesting tension point, that it's both Now, what I
Steve, sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt, Steve. There was, I think, a really good question, which might help to contextualize this discussion for some of the smaller and medium businesses on the call. Because
Yes.
what we're seeing from a National AI Center perspective is that much of the guidance for AI and much of the best practices currently are leaning towards the larger organizations, and many small and medium businesses, not including the deep tech ones who obviously live and breathe technology every day, but many who are not in that tech space are still figuring out their path towards AI. And so some of these conversations that we'll have, in the panel, and some of the information we'll share, while it may not be directly applicable to a small and medium business, it would definitely be questions to ask your technology providers, how they are implementing these principles, because much of the SME experience of technology will likely be through procurement and vendor selection. So whether it's something that you're doing in-house yourself, or whether it's a set of questions and understanding that you bring to your conversation with procurement and technology partnerships, it's still very important. It's just how you, which conversations you connected into and how that pans out for your organization.
Yeah, no, that was a really good audience question, and particularly about, I think the question was, well, where do I start? For a smaller organization, and I, can see, recognize the action gap. Where should a small organization start? Does it start at the top? Does it start with accountability, or do you start or is that something that's more relevant to large organizations?
I mean, generally what we've seen small and medium businesses start with, and I'm going to be leaning onto small a little bit just for a second. We've seen that the existing tech investments that the organization has typically have AI add-ons or services that are optional, but not necessarily known by the small and medium business. And so the things that come to mind for me are CRM or accounting software or ERP or HR tools. A lot of the time they will have AI within them already. So what that small or medium organization wants to do is make sure they're asking the responsible AI questions of their suppliers. How are they removing bias from that data? But typically that's what we've seen.
Yep, and they'll not necessarily be interacting with the vendor; they'll be interacting with the partner rather than So that ecosystem is an really important part to make sure that you ask those questions to the channel, to those partners. Absolutely.
And it's just as important for the larger organizations, this concept of ecosystem resonance or supply chain resonance. Your own organization could make all the greatest principles, methodologies, practice, and technology choices, but that will be exposed based on the kind of partnerships that you establish, both from a technology landscape, from a business landscape, from a supply chain landscape, and so forth.
Great. And there have been questions, posted in the chat and in the Q&A about best practices, for example, about obtaining and using training data to ensure it's representative, diverse, and free from biases. So that's a good question. I think we'll try and answer questions like that. If we can then look at the report included, 7 steps. I think, Bill, you're one of the co-authors of the Gradient report, which is going to be published fairly soon by the NAIC, which is about, the practice of responsible AI. So I think we've taken 7 examples of there, but I think there were another 20 odd examples in there, and I'm sure there'll be many more. But we can talk through some of these, because I think we felt these were also a really good starting point. And obviously, conducting pilot studies obviously therefore means that, you're more likely to be using training data. So I think we can get into the question about best practice for using training data as part of that. But Bill and Chris, you together kind of work together a little bit on this slide that's in the main report. So maybe, Bill, you want to sort of kick off first in terms of talking through some of these practical steps. And they are numbered from 1 to 7, but I imagine you didn't have to start at number 1. Or maybe you do. Bill, I'll hand over to you.
So, in the report that will be released very shortly from Gradient Institute and the National AI Centre, we go through each of the 8 of the federal government's principles, AI ethics principles, And for each of those 8 principles, we identified 3 to 4 practices that we think are really important practices that will help an organisation meet those principles. And those practices, this document, as following on from what Stela said, it's been deliberately designed for small to medium enterprises. It's all very relevant for large organisations as well, but it's very practical and designed to be useful for people who are fairly early on their journey, as well as those who are advanced on the journey. There is a lot of information out there now, but it's actually quite hard to navigate, and it's changing all the time. The whole point of this document is to say, given those principles, how do you actually map that onto good practice? So 3 to 4 practices for each of the principles, and then for each of those 3 to 4 practices, so 26 in total, so 26 practices, there's links to online resources that we think at Gradient Institute, we think are the best, most useful resources out there. We explain each of the resources. It's not just a list of links. We say, use this one for this purpose, use this for this purpose. And then where there's a gap, where we actually think there's not a lot of good resources out there, we try to describe what organisations should do. So we hope it. So carrying on from the example I talked about before, fairness. It'll talk about so under the principle of fairness, there'd be 3 practices. Those are contextualized fairness, with considering the organisation, what it's trying to achieve, what applications and systems are relevant here, and with a lot of detail on actual techniques and tools that are out there that help you contextualize fairness, help you do interviews with affected users and so on. Then there'll be a set of resources on measuring fairness, what different fairness metrics there are out there, when you apply which ones and so on, depending on the context. And then where you do have unfairness, how do you actually make changes to your data curation? How do you make changes to the algorithm such that you address any fairness issues? So again, really pragmatic. It's not just saying be fair, it's actually telling you exactly what to do. And so I actually genuinely think it's a really useful report. I'm not one of the co-authors, Steve. The team, members of the team, yes. 3 Gradient Institute staff wrote it. I think it's an incredibly useful report. I've read it multiple times, and I think it's incredibly useful. And Chris kindly was one of the reviewers as well. So it's got a lot of his wisdom in there as well. It will be released soon. If in the meantime you do want to know more about practices, feel free to contact Gradient Institute, and we can help you. But when that's out, it'll be publicly available, and I hope it will be useful to lots of people.
Yeah, great. And hopefully we can find a way of making sure that everybody who's register for the webinar, we've got your details, so we can make sure that once it's published, you'll get the link so you can then access these really important resources. Chris, your thoughts in terms of where to start, and also get you to take the question about best practices for using training data at the same time.
I can, although I don't think I've seen that question, so you might have to read it to me. But I think just touching on the report that Bill mentioned, as you said, Bill, I had a chance to review a couple of draft versions of that, and I think I said at the time it was the report I wish I'd had 5 years ago when I was trying to work this stuff out myself. So it's incredibly useful advice and practical things that people can do. What we try and do is really embed practices within the general model life cycle and development cycle and just general business practices that we have. I don't think it's useful to have a separate responsible AI process to follow. I think you've got to really try and embed it in your business process as it is, as much as you can. And so that's really what we've been trying to do over the last few years. So and you can really use common risk management practices in a lot of these. So things like assessing impacts, which is written there, number 1, quite important to do that quite quickly. You can do that before you've even built a model as a desktop exercise to think about what could go wrong and what could improve people's lives and what could make things worse. What you tend to find in practice with things like that is that people will obviously be quite excited about the positive impacts that their system are going to have. They'll have thought that through quite a lot. They maybe won't have thought through some of the negatives. Maybe they're not as obvious to the people who are trying to build a system. And so bringing in common risk management practices like reverse stress testing, for example, coming up with a really bad situation and then trying to get the people building the system to work out how that bad situation could arise from their process is a an example of a technique that we try to use to really tease out what could go wrong. So lots of things to think about in all this. We published a paper as part of the pilot of the government's responsible AI or ethical AI practices a couple of years ago, which people can find. Goes through quite a lot of what we do in some depth. So refer people to that if they want to know more about some of the things that we do. And you said there was a question, Steve, but I still don't know if I can see it.
That's okay. It's actually in the chat, but it says, so what are the best practices for obtaining and using training data to ensure it's representative, diverse, and free from bias?
Oh, gosh, I think it depends on what you're doing. So I don't know that, I think with free from biases, you want to make sure that your data is free from unreasonable or unfair biases. All data is going to have some biases in it. That's just what happens when any sort of data is collected from any process. It's not going to be a representative sample of the population. It's going to be collected in some way, so it's going to contain some biases, but some biases are okay. So you've got to be careful about whether your biases are reasonable or unreasonable. With some guidance that I helped write with the Actuaries Institute and the Human Rights Commission that touches on some of that, which was published December last year, which people can have a look at if they want to. So it's just important to think carefully, where did your data come from? Is it reasonable to use it for this purpose? Does it represent the actual problem that I'm trying to solve, or is it some sort of proxy or pseudo problem? And think quite carefully through how your data is then used to effectively decisions. So there's an awful lot of literature on this one question, and that's probably part of the problem, is that there's lots of things out there and people struggle about where to start, but it is a little bit tricky.
What I might suggest is for folks who are just entering in this space, there are already some interesting and very useful AI standards that are out from the International Standards Organization. There is one in particular that talks about how to manage bias in data. So that one is already out. And I'm not saying that's the whole answer, but it is great for the folks who are starting on this journey. It shares some methodologies, some kind of common approaches to address those, as well as some terminology and taxonomy in that area. There will be a lot more AI standards that are coming. In fact, this year, the AI management system standard is probably going to be quite transformative for the commercial sector around the world, because it will be asking for 3 governance checkpoints of every AI system. And so currently, industry is by and large not doing this for every single AI system, but these will be the kind of things that are asked for when partnerships are formed, when supplier relationships are formed. You know, what do you adhere to these standards? Do you achieve this quality benchmark when it comes to, you know, bias or fairness of the algorithm? So I would encourage folks to have a look at that.
Great, thanks. There was a question also from the audience, which was, what role do you see boards and directors playing in encouraging the development of AI strategy and encouraging innovation in this space? So obviously, you know, the report highlights the importance of the CEO, but this also kind of, you know, talks to the role of the board and other directors as well. You know, Artak, would you like to have a crack at answering that question, please?
Sure.
Yeah,
and that's actually a good one, because our board, actually, we just had a chat with one of the board members. It's very relevant and topical at the moment, because we have to keep in mind that the boards are the one who hired the CEO, right? They keep the CEO in the job. That's the board's kind of a decision. And the problems we had with all sorts of data breaches, right, showed us that paying attention to these sorts of things, like particularly privacy and things like that, the data you collect and then don't use, are really important and can make and break for even the CEO's job, right? So the board have very, very important responsibility to make sure that those sorts of practices, fairness and responsible AI and everything else that kind of comes along with that, is actually implemented. Because your CIO or your other people are going to go and then ask for funding, and they're going to kind of implement the strategy, and the board is the one who's going to approve it. And if they are not focused on these sorts of things, at the end of the day, that's going to be a decision for the company, right? It's going to affect the company. How many companies we have seen affected with millions of dollars of fines and reputational damage that because of the problems we had with the breaches and everything else, right? So I would say, just a kind of a simple answer, it's really important to have a board who actually thinks through into the principles and asks the question, right? As Stela was saying, when you ask the question, that's a kind of almost half the job is done, because when you ask the question, someone else has to think about the answer, right? And that someone has to think about the answer, they have to do something, do some research, and come back with actions that they have to do. So that's my view into this.
Yeah, great. Chris,
just one more thing I want to add into the actions one. We are actually started to we saw that this problem from the principle and the action before, and this year we sponsoring a PhD student actually in collaboration with Monash University and Data 61, whose PhD topic was going to be exactly like that. It's going to how to implement responsible AI practices in software engineering, right? And that's PhD student going to come and work with us. So that's from the industry partner perspective with the Monash University and Data 61 all together. By the end of it, what I want, and I said this kind of for sponsoring this, I want to have some kind of an open source something, right, that we can share back to the community. Because as a big business, we have this kind of responsibility, right? We can invest some money into the places where the small companies can't, right? So we have this responsibility to do it and then also share it back to the others.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that's really important. Chris, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, just going back to the original question about what can boards and directors do. So as Artak was talking, I remember there was a paper that myself, a few folks at Gradient Institute published a year or so ago called De-risking Automated Decisions. And in that, we go through the Institute of Company Directors Principles for Good Governance and suggest questions that directors could ask of management within each of those sort of categories. So if people are wondering what sorts of questions they might want to think about asking, that's perhaps a good place to start.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Stela.
We do a lot of work with board directors, and we're also partnering with the Australian Institute of Company Directors to design board training in the AI space. And one of the interesting things that we've observed is AI is a foreign topic for a lot of board members. There are some obviously who are much more mature, but for most it is a new topic. And by default, they're actually giving it to the Audit and Risk Committee. And straight away, that changes the dynamic of the AI conversation from one of opportunity and navigating that opportunity responsibly to one that is more about protecting and risk aversion. And so being really mindful of bringing your board along in terms of understanding and education is really going to reshape that conversation about the opportunities that AI has for your organization. So it doesn't just default into the risk and audit committee, but rather the full opportunities discussed. And one of the gentlemen on the panel earlier mentioned, rather than AI governance being its own silo and setting up new processes, you want to think about how AI can get integrated or connected into existing governance. And it's been really fascinating to see how much connection there is between ESG and responsible AI. You know, privacy is also part of ESG. So is diversity and fairness is also part of ESG. Partnerships as well are part of that. And so finding those connection points and augmenting them makes it much easier for board to get engaged.
Yeah, much easier to join the dots up at a higher level. I've got a few minutes left. I've got 5 minutes to go. And, you know, we've touched on the importance, I think, of ecosystems. And I, obviously said at the beginning, Stela, the work that, ultimately NAIC, what you're leading on there in terms of building out that ecosystem. And I think we can't do this without this ecosystem. It's really important. But Sounds great. Can you just expand on that in the few minutes that we have left to give the audience a flavor of where you're going with this?
Sure, and I'll try to do it in a minute because I'm sure that more folks want to add to this. So AI requires many different disciplines coming together because it really is holistic in terms of how it can activate an organization, and also the impact it provides can be non-linear. It can have some unintended things, and so multidisciplinary effort is really critical. And also, no one organization has the solution to all of responsible AI. And so that is why we've established the Responsible AI Network, which is bringing together expert partners across Australia to help us centralize and curate those best practices. So for instance, Artak, as you mentioned that you have a report that you want to make available to more folks. Well, the Responsible AI Network is how we're centralizing that guidance so that industry can find it. And we're partnering with ecosystem organizations across industry representation organizations such as Australian Industry Group, also technology industry representation such as Tech Council, AAAA, also with CEDA, with Gradient Institute that's on this call, with the Ethics Centre, Standards Australia, because there's also a very strong regulatory element to responsible AI. And we hope by partnering together, we're able to simplify what responsible AI means with some of these best practices. So please, all of everyone on this call, you're welcome to join us. We will be centralizing curated content from expert leaders around Australia.
And that's easy to find on the NAIC website, part of CSIRO. It's easy to navigate from there, yeah?
That's right, csiro.au/NAIC. Nick, I'll put it in the chat window.
Yeah, thanks, Sally, we do that. Bill and Stella mentioned, gradient, and obviously, maybe Bill expand a little bit more in terms of how gradient's helping also to build out that network. I'm actually quite interested, kind of from a global perspective, because if we're starting to develop standards in this space, those standards are also going to be driven from Europe. They're going to be driven from the US. They may also be driven from China. So national networks are really important. How are we kind of plugging into international networks as well? This is something that sits outside of national boundaries, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, difficult question for the last minute. But I mean, we've always had a global focus and kept an eye on things. Our chief scientist is on the OECD network of experts, and we kept track of the OECD, put through that. One of the members of NAIC is heavily involved in the standards, the global standards movement, and responsible AI standards. And so, in Australia, we have lots of people who are engaged in the global. We lost
okay. No, you're there. You're on. Now you're on. Now you're. It's all over to you.
So we have lots of people engaged in the global discussions. We talk frequently with the federal government here about our regulation. There are lots of people in Australia who are doing likewise. We're also coordinating discussions like that through the Responsible AI Network that Stella mentioned. There's a lot happening, huge amounts happening. I should also mention that the report that we talked about before, it does cover both decision-making AI and generative AI, like large language models like ChatGPT and so on. The sorts of considerations that have always been there in AI are still there with large language models. There's a lot of additional concerns, and we're covering all of those as well. Back to you, Steve.
Thanks a lot, Bill. Now, I'm glad you touched on large language models, because I mentioned it at the beginning as well. And have LLMs really kind of just dramatically changed the AI landscape? Can we kind of maybe parting thoughts there before we sign off?
Sorry, Matt, I have to go.
Yeah.
I just
you're being
okay.
I'll ask
Thank
Chris.
you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Artak. Pleasure. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Yeah, Chris, I'll just ask you 1 minute. Large language models, is that going to change the
dynamic? Sure, why not? I think it's been fascinating to watch the level of excitement, right? But I think, as Bill said before, a lot of the themes that we talk about here are just equally to large language models as well. There's probably additional concerns as well, but certainly the themes that we talk about in this report and that responsible AI as a ecosystem's talking about apply to what I tend to call boring AI as much as it does to all this new fancy stuff. So you need to do it whether you're doing boring or fancy stuff.
Excellent. That's a good way to finish off. Well, look, thanks to everybody. Pleasure. I think it was a great discussion. I really appreciate everyone's time today. We will send people today. You'll have access to a recording of the webinar as well. Please do share this as well. It's important. This is important work. Been a pleasure working with everybody today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.